Hello, I'm Julie Ayton and I run a pottery in the middle of Salisbury where I do a certain amount of teaching and I make my own work in porcelain and stoneware. And here I'm going to show you the stages of making a teapot. And this is a piece of clay, a couple of pounds in weight, and having centred it, I've opened it up with my thumb and I'm making the base first. And you do that because you can get at it while the rest of the clay is nice and low. Later on it's very difficult to put in the compression that you need to put in on the base, which stops the pot from cracking and firing. So I'm going to now lift the walls of that pot. Although I'm aiming for this to be an oval shape when it's done, I'm going to throw it to begin with into a cylinder form, but I'm going to leave the rim quite thick, and I'm going to do that intentionally because a little bit later I'm going to split that rim into two so that it can hold a lid securely, so that when you're pouring from the teapot the lid doesn't drop out. So a couple of lifts, getting that clay up in a straight line, getting the height out of it first before attempting to change the form. This is a trusty old kick wheel, so it doesn't go particularly quickly. It dictates the pace really. One more pull for height and to thin that clay. And while the walls are vertical, I'm going to split that heavy rim into two to give a ledge for the lid to sit on and a rim to finish off the pot. So there's the inside little ledge and the outside one. And I'm going to turn those outwards now so that I can get my hand in to swell that form out without damaging that rim. It'll come back again later. There we go. So having split the rim, the next job is to swell out this form. Come back in again, a little bit narrower at the rim there. So I think we could do with a fuller form than that. Starting right at the base, pushing that out again. A little bit of lift at the shoulder. And I'm going to collar that rim in a little bit more for a bit more sense of enclosure. And you can see now that little ledge is pointing in horizontally, ready for a lid to go on there. I think I'll swell out the bottom part of that form. So I've got quite a compressed sphere shape to this one. To dry out the inside. Water gathered in the bottom of a pot is another reason why the base might crack during drying if the base gets too soggy, so that's nice and dry inside now. And I'm going to use a rib just to take away the excess bit of clay at the bottom there. I'm going to pull pull that rim over a little bit and depress the inside so that the lid will sit in there quite securely in use. I like that little bit of definition, so the rim has a collar. And I'm going to take some of the excess slurry off the surface of this, and it will just make the shape that little bit tauter as it goes round. To finish off, I'm going to use a leather over the edge of the rim there, and that helps to flatten the little particles of clay, which helps reduce chipping later when the lid is going in and out. Just tease that over a little bit more. Actually, just before cutting, I'll take the measurement for the lid there. I'm not going to do this while the teapot's moving round, because that way lies disaster. Okay, my lid measurement I'm going to undercut. It sometimes distorts the pot, so better to measure first. And that one is ready to put to one side. Hello again, this is the teapot that you saw me throwing yesterday, and it's now in the right condition for turning. It's what we call cheese hard or leather hard. So I'm putting it back on centre upside down, and my aim now is to take away the little bit of excess clay at the bottom here and to give it a little undercut, a little bevel, which will be where the glaze finishes, so that there's a little margin of safety between the glazed area of the pot and the kiln shelf, so that if I were to put a fluid glaze on this, it wouldn't be in danger of running over that corner and onto the glaze shelf, the kiln shelf. So you can see here this is in lovely condition for turning. These strands of clay are just rolling away there, and that shows that the clay's at just the right moisture content for this job. Clay is the most amazing material in that its properties change as its water content reduces. So it goes from being a slip or a slurry, which is almost like a sort of paint consistency, and is used for decorating and of course for joining pots together, and then also for slip casting, which isn't something that I know a lot about. And then the next stage of softness that we use it as studio potters is for throwing, where it needs to be a little bit softer than for almost any other process. And then we allow it to dry a little bit and it becomes carvable, which is what it's like now. So that's that little bevel that I spoke about on the edge there. I'm softening that bottom angle so that it's not scratchy later, but I'm leaving this angle just here quite sharp, so that if it does have a fluid glaze, it will stop there and it will be inhibited from going over that sharp angle and sticking the pot to a kiln shelf. The tool I've been using here is a piece of banding steel. It's a homemade tool made from the kind of banding steel that used to be what was used to hold paving slabs or pallets of bricks together in the days before we became addicted to plastic, and plastic webbing and yards of cling film got used instead. It's easily bent into shape if you can get hold of some. It's a brilliant self-sharpening turning tool. So that's that turned, and the next job will be to show you how to attach the spout that I threw yesterday. Thanks for watching. Hi again. I'm going to show you now how I finish off the lid, which was thrown upside down off the hump yesterday and now needs to be turned over. It's dried a lot to leather hard stage, and I'm going to trim this top bit, take a tiny bit off the width because the fit is a little bit too snug at the moment. It's not quite sitting in as I'd like, and I'm going to add a little knob at the top, and this is the right stage to do that. So get that on centre. I'm going to fix that. Although it's nice and low and wide, I've put it down on a wooden bat here. And because the wooden bat is absorbent, this piece of damp clay, which would stick quite happily to a metal wheel head, is liable to come adrift on this wooden absorbent surface. So those little bits of clay are just to secure it in place. And I know from my measurement yesterday that that finished just a little bit generously there, and I've tried it in the pot and it needs a few mil taking off. So I'm going to do that first. And then I'm going to take away this excess clay from the underneath. I need a little bit more speed for that. When you're working on something with a very narrow diameter, as with the throwing of the spouts that I showed you yesterday, you need more speed because at the point of contact your finger or the turning tool is having the effect of touching something which isn't moving quite so fast, although the revolutions are the same all the way around here. The distance the clay is travelling close to the centre and further from the centre means that the clay under that point of contact is moving much more slowly in the centre of the wheel than it is further out, and that affects how much pressure you can put on, how safe it is to apply that pressure, whether you're throwing or turning. And so a little bit of speed when you're working within a narrow area is really helpful. So I'm giving the old kick wheel a bit of welly there. Okay, that's that shape. I'm reasonably confident that's now a comfortable fit for the teapot. And so my next job is to throw on this little piece of clay for a knob. It's going to look roughly like that, so that's quite useful as a size gauge. But for actually attaching it, that same shape is easier to attach the other way up because it gives me a bigger surface to attach, a bigger cross section to attach there. So I'm going to roughen up the surface of both the lid and the bit of clay there for the knob, and then I'm going to use a little blob of slurry from my throwing water. So that prepares the surfaces for being joined together securely. The cross hatching gives much more surface area, and then both surfaces get meshed together, and that little bit of agitation helps to force those particles into each other and means that you've got a really good join there. So that's this tiny little bit of clay, and the wheel will get a little bit noisy now because I'm going to use more speed and fingertips now to throw this little piece of clay onto the lid there. So it's throwing in miniature, essentially. centering that little bit of clay, making sure that it's well attached at the bottom there. I don't want to get this too wet. Let's take away some of that moisture, and trying to limit the water to the soft clay that I'm trying to form. Now the form of the teapot is quite wide, and though usually my tendency is to make taller shapes here, I'm going to allow this to have quite a broad shape at the top to echo the form of the teapot that this lid is for. You want to have it a comfortable shape that is friendly for fingers to come down and take away. I may also use a rib in there to ensure that I have a single line. Just at that point, a note on sponged surfaces. Sponging clay, if there's any grog in that clay at all, will tend to bring up the grog, and so it's not really the friendliest way to leave a surface. Thrown surfaces are lovely, sponged surfaces tend to leave the grit still standing when the clay is dry. So using a wooden rib to flatten that down or skim off the surface after sponging is a good idea. I think that will do. So I'm going to show you how to turn the teapot body next, and then we'll get on to attaching the spout that I threw. Thanks for watching. Hi again. What I'm going to show you now is how we throw off the hump a smaller section of clay from that, which is used to form the lid for a teapot and the spout. And throwing off the hump is something that potters will often do also for making little test bowls or small fiddly pieces, because you can get your hands right round the clay rather than having to contend with the wheel surface getting in the way. So it doesn't matter whether that's centred or not, this is the bit that we are concerned with. And I'm going to take an educated guess as to how much clay I need there and open that up like a small bowl, first of all, to make the lid. So the kind of lid that I'm making is going to fit into that gallery that I made in the teapot and have a similar split rim, so that the full width of the lid sits down inside the upright rim of the teapot, and the horizontal part rests on the horizontal flange in the teapot, and then the middle part here will sit down inside the void of the teapot and produce a counterbalance. Now at this stage, before I go any further, I'm going to just see how much width I've got to play with. A little bit more there. So I'm going to take that a bit further out now. I've begun to split that rim, and I'm going to split that a bit more decisively now. And I find pushing that down with my thumb creates a good division of the clay, and it spreads out that rim to something close to what I'm looking for. I've got a few mil to play with, which is quite nice at this stage. So I'm going to lift this flange, the one that's going to drop down inside the horizontal flange on the teapot. This is when you realise that flange is a very odd word. I'm going to finish that, and in a moment I'll use the leather on that again to keep it strong, because it's going to be going in and out of that teapot many times and it needs to be strong. I can finish throwing that part out, and if I need a little bit more width at this stage, then I'm going to find that I'll need to extend from inside there. I think that's actually close to being there. So I'll just put a little bit of compression into the base there, and then, as I say, use my leather to finish both of those rims. I'm going to use a rib to give myself a little bit of definition in there to make sure that that's a nice snugly fitting corner, and then in fact prepare to take it off by putting a deep V below what I can see is the depth inside here. So I want to make sure that I don't cut a hole in the bottom when I take this off. I'm going to just use a thin nylon wire to do this. I'll save showing you all of the clever cuts with a spear for another day. So that's that, comes off on 4 fingers and is ready for drying and for turning tomorrow. And now I'm going to show you how the spout is made off the hump as well. So I pull up a little bit more clay from the hump, and again this is about an educated guess for how much clay to use. And I find for a teapot spout, for a £2 teapot, I'm looking at the size of a clementine, if we want to be specific about our citrus fruit. And I'm going to make that as a funnel shape, wide at the bottom, coming up narrow. It will have a lot of trimming later, so it doesn't matter too much if it's a little bit thick at the base. But I do want to get a little bit of height and colouring into this. And because of the narrowness of this piece of throwing, the wheel speed needs to go up a bit so that the clay here close to the centre is moving fast enough for me to be able to put pressure on it and to throw. So it pushes the old kick wheel through its paces a little bit. I've thinned out that clay nearly as far as it wants to go, and I'm now going to collar it in, which will also have the effect of re-thickening the clay that I've already thrown. You can see it's substantially narrower, and it's given the wall of the clay a bit more thickness. So I can now get back inside there and bring up some more height. And now I'll alternate collaring that in and throwing it. What I'm looking for is a nice spread at the base, which gives plenty of cross-sectional area where the tea enters the spout, and a much smaller cross-section up here at the top, where the tea is going to leave the spout, hopefully under a bit of pressure, which will help the spout pour well. It really doesn't matter what this looks like at the top, because that's going to get trimmed substantially anyway. And I'm going to show you that in a later video. I'm going to use the rib to smooth that off and refine the form a little bit more, give it a little bit of compression. And then, as with the lid, give it a really good deep undercut there to give myself a finger hold. Unlike the lid, it has no bearing whether I cut through the bottom or not, because we don't need a base in a teapot spout. So I'm going to just cut that through like that and lift that off too. So by tomorrow that will have dried enough for me to show you how to attach that to the teapot. Thanks for watching. What I'm going to show you now is attaching the spout to the teapot. So that's the lid that I showed you turning and putting the knob on yesterday. There it is now, a nice fit in there, and you can see how those galleries fit together. And for the purposes of putting the spout on, I'm going to remove that so that we can make a better judgment of what's needed here. And what I want to do is to attach that spout at about 45 degrees onto the pot there. And to do that, it's going to need a fair bit of trimming. So to start with, I'm going to take away a crescent of clay, starting from quite high up on one side of this, and I'm going to come down to the full width of the base there. So to begin with, I'm going to be quite bold, and I'm just going to cut that off. Do it in sections. And there you can see where it came off the hump. Take that away. There'll be more trimming after this, but this is just so that we can put it in place on the side of the pot and see that we're somewhere close. You can see that there's all this excess clay in the way. We don't want that. It's going to be fitting onto a curved surface that way, so I'm going to create a curved surface inside there. And as I say, this may not be the final surface. We'll find that out when we get it a bit closer to the pot. I'm just using an ordinary little craft knife here. Works really well. It's got a fine blade. And the clay again is at that really satisfying leather hard stage, so it just cuts through like a nice mature cheddar. That'll do for now. So I'm going to rest that on the pot, and then I'm going to look straight across the top of the spout there, because a really vital thing is to check that the lower point of the spout is at least as high as the highest level of liquid in that pot. And a very common beginner mistake is to drop that down so that the water poured in there comes out of the spout before you've actually filled the pot, and that's one of the commonest mistakes that people make when they're learning to make teapots. That's not bad. That's really not a bad fit for a straight off cut, so I'm going to go with that. I'll do a little bit more refining, but essentially I can see looking straight on that the end of the spout there is level with that crease between the body and the collar of the rim. So I'm going to mark that, and that essentially is where I'm going to be joining my spout. I'll mark that on the side of the pot, and I will just do a little bit more refining on that spout to thin the clay just here at the base of it, where there's a little bit of extra clay. But that's not bad. Come back to that in a minute. So here we've got the outside shape of the spout, and looking at the inside shape, you can see that the wall is quite thin here and it's much wider at the bottom there. So the shape that the water is going to flow through, or tea if you're making your tea properly, is going to be more or less a circle there, due to the shape of the spout intersecting with the shoulder of the teapot there. On this shape of teapot, it gives you more or less a circle. And I'm going to draw a vertical line up there to give me a guide for drilling holes through. So I'm going to put that aside for a moment while I finish trimming this spout. And what I really want to do is create a more or less even thickness at the bottom here, so that it's a nice even fit onto the surface of the teapot all the way around. This is also an opportunity, if you're left a little bit of thickness at the base there, you can cut out a little bit more inside here. This is pretty thin already, so I'm not going to worry about doing that. But while I've got it in my hand, I may as well prepare for joining it on. So as ever, this is about increasing the surface area for the water in the slurry to seep into the clay there. And when I do exactly the same on the surface it's going to join, that will ensure that it's a good, secure fit, and indeed a watertight one. So that's just a good rough surface, and I'm going to leave that's ready joined. So going back to the teapot, I've got my guideline here, and what we want is to get the biggest area of collective holes. I don't know what the collective term for holes is, but what I'm doing here is going straight down the middle, really quite close together with the hole borer. And this is really dependent on the clay being in nice condition. If the clay is too hard, then it's going to crack when this happens. This last one I tend to do at a shallow angle to really feed into the belly of the pot here. And then I'm going to go down in a honeycomb shape here, because that enables you to get the most air to clay ratio, rather than doing it in a simple square grid pattern. So these are really coming out neatly, but it doesn't matter at all if they fall inside the pot. They can be got out later. It really doesn't matter. There's something quite satisfying about doing this. If I were doing some kind of slip decoration on this teapot, or raw glazing it, which I do sometimes, I'd have done that already by this stage, before cutting all these holes and a spout to make it more complicated. But I'm going to glaze this one conventionally, which will be the subject of a later video, I hope. I think that'll do there. So I'm going to follow exactly that same pattern now, going down the other side. And the function, obviously, of a grid like this at the bottom of the spout used to be to hold the tea leaves back, and of course most people now use tea bags even in a teapot. But of course, if you don't have some form of structure at the bottom to hold a tea bag getting stuck halfway up a spout is not really very helpful. So I think I said when I was throwing the spout that to help with a good pour, what you want is the collective area of all of these little holes to be a good bit bigger than the cross section at the bottom of the spout, at the top of the spout rather. Forgetting what I'm saying. So what we're looking at is the comparison between the end of the spout there and the collective area of all of those little holes. Now I'm going to give that another little trim. This is a completely optional bit of teapot making, but I'm going to skim away a little bit of thickness here. Now that I can see how much clay I've got to play with there, I'm really going to take that down to a thickness below what I would use or aim for the rest of the wall of the pot. That's really going to be quite a sort of delicate thickness there now. There's not really a lot of clay there at all, and very quickly just tidy a few of those. And the reason that I do that is entirely to do with how the pot takes glaze. When it's glazed, one of the things you really don't want to happen is these holes clogging up with glaze. So there are a couple of things that I do to help prevent that. And one of them is that trimming off of thickness, because the thinner the clay there, the less likely it is to take on too thick a glaze layer. The thin clay there gets saturated very quickly and tends to only take on a very thin glaze layer. There's just a little bit of flexibility there, so I'm going to push that a bit flatter. And again, with tea bags, that just helps to stop them getting caught in the curve on the inside there and blocking the spout. So now the counterpart to what I did earlier. This is preparing to stick the spout on. Just in case you're wondering what the second thing is that I do, by the way, to stop the spout clogging up. Just before glazing, I'll use a brush in water and simply saturate that little area, or pre-wet it a little bit, so that I can be sure it does saturate without allowing thick glaze to accumulate, because it's really quite difficult to get a bit of wire or fiddle around trying to reach in and clear these holes. It's a more or less impossible job, so you really want to avoid doing that if you can. There we go. So all that remains now is for this piece to be added onto this piece. So I'm going to just wet that one slightly, just to make sure it's nice and soft. And this one, I'm going to put slurry on there. It's quite wet. I want to be sure that it's really soaking into that cross hatching that I did earlier. And then a little bit more on there. Going to just make sure I've got the alignment right as that goes on. So I'm double checking that I can see down through the spout there to the pattern of holes and that I'm vertical. And I've got that vital level right on there. It's just a second visual check, having having already drawn it previously, just to make sure. And then a wet finger I like to see the definition between the two pieces. I've done teapots in the past where I've done my utmost to hide that join, and then subsequently decided actually I rather enjoy the interplay between the shapes. So I tend to leave that. And the final thing, now that that's on there, is to trim the spout. So I tend to leave that. And the final thing, now that that's on there, is to trim the spout. And I'm not convinced whether cutting it at an angle actually improves the pour, but visually it looks a little more elegant. So here's this peculiarity with teapot spouts, that because they're so narrow, they've been subjected to a deformation when they were on the wheel, a twisting deformation. And this continues in the firing. So this is a sort of famous thing amongst potters, that rather than cutting that slope in a directly top to bottom direction from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock, as it were, we actually, depending on the clay that you're using and how much deformation that particular clay has, so porcelain is quite severe, different stonewares not so much, but I'm going to cut the slope at about tea time, at about 5 to the hour to 5 o'clock. So instead of 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock, I'm going to put little marks at 11 o'clock and 5 o'clock, and at 11 o'clock I'm going to cut away the most clay, and at 5 o'clock I'm going to cut away no clay. So I'm going to mark that first, like that. So it's as though the pot wasn't on here and I was actually cutting, sloping that down like that. I always do this after I've attached the spout, because I can really be sure that I'm doing it in the right direction. I just don't think I've got that good a visual memory to be able to trim both the bottom and the top of the spout in the right direction and then join it on. I believe there are potters that do, and I take my hat off to them. So I'm cutting that away, so you can see there that looks peculiar and twisted at the moment. It's pointing off in what appears to be the wrong direction, slightly to the left with the spout away from you. And it seems hard to believe at this stage that that will straighten up, but as you get used to the clay that you're using, you find that it does. And so I'm going to just push in the grit. There's a very little bit of quite fine grog in this clay, and I don't want to sponge the clay because that will drag the grit up, but a wet finger around there is quite a useful tool. And I'm going to just soften that top there a little bit. But down here, I want this to stay quite sharp. It's a moot point with teapots because you want them to pour as well as possible. And of course, it's a vulnerable point for chipping. But at the same time, you want it to be able to pour without dripping. So that's that so far, and the next video will be showing pulling a handle on there, and that will be the finished teapot. Hi again, and welcome to my putting a handle on a teapot video. We've done a whole series now of making the pot and the lid and the spout and putting those all together, so the handle is the final thing. I'm going to do that in two parts, pulling a stub and then attaching. But first of all, I just wanted to say a quick thing about the hole in the lid of a teapot, which I hadn't done last time you saw this. It's contrary to popular belief It's not for letting steam out, it's actually to let air in as you pour tea from the pot, and it's to prevent a vacuum forming back here, which would affect the pouring there. And while on that, it leaves a burr on the inside when you use a hole borer to make that hole. And cleaning that burr off, I leave until the clay is quite dry, and the same in the spout there. I do it just before it goes into biscuit firing, and that way those little bits of clay are dry and they fall out easily and aren't in danger of blocking the base of the spout. So back to handles. I've prepared this clay by hand wedging, which is a process of tearing a handful of clay in two and slapping it back together so that these layers form. And the layers are an important part of the structure of the clay. We tend to think of it as an amorphous lump, but clay does have a structure, and the little platelets that it's formed from give it an extra strength in the flat plane when it's layered like this, and I'm going to utilise that in the handle. So the first part of pulling the handle, I'm staying aware of those layers as I pat that down into I guess a pear shape. And I'm going to extend the clay, that thin end of the pear. I'm going to extend that down while staying aware of these layers at the top, because I want those to be in this direction, parallel to the layer of clay which is making up the wall of the pot there, the actual teapot wall. So two parts to this, and the first is squeezing that out to create the stub, which is going to be quite thick. If you imagine that it's the same kind of thickness and would give the same support as a saucepan handle would on there, that's what you're aiming for the first stage of this. I'll make several while I'm about it, because I've got a few teapots to do, but that's enough for now. And I'm going to chop that off vertically where the clay is really beginning to widen here, and that's because I really want quite a big surface area where the handle is joined. The top join of a handle is the one that bears all the weight of that pot when it's full. It's carrying all of the weight under tension here, whereas at the bottom the handle is under compression, so the bottom join is not carrying the weight in the same way. So we really want that slight extra cross section at the top of the handle. So what I'm looking for here in a stub is that there are no pinches in there. There are no weak spots. It's a good, solid, extruded piece of clay. So attaching that to the pot is the next thing. Take the handle out, the lid out, so that we don't accidentally tip it out when attaching a handle. I'm sure we've all done it at some point or another. Obviously that's got to be directly opposite the spout there, so I put this mark down first, and then taking a judgment as to where I want that top join to be, I'm going to prepare an area of this wall that's really quite big. It's bigger than the join will look when it's finished. But this is the firmer of the two pieces of clay. This is now leather hard. And I really want the slurry to get in there and make sure that the soft clay of the handle makes a good attachment in there. So I'm going to wet that down. Use some of that handle pulling slurry, which is fabulous stuff. So that goes on there. And then I'm going to pick up the stub with a wet hand, being careful not to pinch it. I really don't want to jeopardise how nicely that will pull on from there. So this surface here is just tacky. I'm not preparing it in any other way. It's only just been pulled, so it's nice soft clay. And I'm going to support inside that, offer that up, put it on, and as I say, with a wet hand from the back of the handle, I'm going to wiggle that forwards so that the soft top end, the broad end of that handle, spreads out over that prepared area and it will grip quite quickly. I'm just going to check that that's properly opposite and that I'm happy with where that is. That's great. So I'm now going to lift that and balance that handle vertically. And all the way through this process from now on, I'm going to be careful not to wave the pot around and make that join flex. The less it's flexed, the stronger it will stay. And I really want to, as I say, make sure that there's no reason for this handle to have a weak spot, particularly up there, which is the critical join. So I'm going to weld this in all the way round, pulling the clay from the back of the handle forward to the join and ensuring that that's really had some compression in there. But this is the bit that really determines how successful your handle attaching is, because the danger is that you pinch too much here and create a thin spot exactly where you want it actually to be thickest. So hence the stroking from further up and spreading out so that there is nowhere a place where the clay has got thinner and then gets thicker again towards the end of the handle. That's ready now to turn over, and the thing now is to do that with confidence, not to jiggle around, but to go straight over so that that handle is now hanging down vertically where before it was sticking up vertically. And find a grip that is comfortable. And keeping the spout straight up, I'm looking to now extend that handle downward. So a little more word on pulling here. We call it pulling, but really we're extruding that clay through squeezing and trying to judge it just right so that the clay extends, but you don't suddenly catch and find you've put a thin patch in there. And whenever you put a handle on a pot, you're always juggling function and appearance. And there's the old form follows function edict, which if you're making a functional pot and you want it to work, you really do need to pay attention to the function it's intended for. So a teapot handle, really you don't want it too thin, but there are ways of making it look slenderer than it really is, and one of those is to do with cross section. So a round cross section is going to look quite thick from the side, but it might look quite spindly from edge on. A strap cross section is inherently weak. It's very likely with any kind of impact to break through, so I'm not aiming for a strap shape with this. Rather I'm aiming for a really a sort of diamond shape, so it appears thin at the edges where it catches the light, but there's a thicker spine running down the middle, and that gives it the strength it needs to carry the weight. If you've got a litre teapot, that's a kilo just of liquid, never mind the clay in the pot itself. So again, as I've pulled this, I've been really careful not to flex this join up here. I've tried to stay very vertical as I've done that. This is now quite flexible and it's ready to be looped up. So again, this is a careful process. What I'm going to do is very slightly wet my fingers because it will give me a little bit more grip there, and lift the bottom of the handle while I turn the pot round and determine where I want to attach that. A little bit lower. I'm going to have a little look at the side to ensure that it's vertical. Lucky me, that's right first time. And then I'm going to carefully, having just pressed that on, it's sticky so it will attach, I'm turning that over and round. And I will trim away the real excess from that with a knife. It can be done with a with a little gesture, but potters have their different ways of doing that bit. And I'm going to compress on there. I didn't cross-hatch and slurry because this clay is still damp. It's firm, but it's still damp. And this clay is very soft. And as I say, this isn't the critical join as far as carrying the weight is concerned. And if you prepare that in advance, the likelihood is you'll find when you loop your handle round that you miss it, and you've then just got to tidy up unsightly scratches round there. So that's the teapot. I might leave it upside down to rest for a little bit so that the handle there can stiffen in the right shape without drooping, although that's holding quite nicely. So that's the finished teapot. Well, finished until it gets through a firing, and I hope later to show you another video of glazing. Thanks for watching.